A few years ago, I found myself in a very unsettling situation. I was finishing up my internship in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it had been snowing all day. For those of you who live in the South, you know it's a big deal when snow is even predicted, and people stock up on groceries in advance. I decided to stop by the store to buy groceries for myself and my girlfriend, now wife. As the chaos had died down and only those with trucks or all-terrain vehicles could get around, I went into Walmart, grabbed what I needed, and started heading back to my truck. The snow had started coming down heavier, and there was already about 5 to 7 inches on the ground, and it was about 12 p.m. I was daydreaming about sledding and watching movies with my girlfriend in the next couple of days. Almost at my truck, I was startled when someone grabbed my arm. I turned around and saw an older woman, maybe about 5 feet 6 inches. She asked me if I had a cigarette. I don't smoke, so I told her I didn't, then turned back to my truck. Again, she gently tugged on my arm. She told me she had just gotten here from Alabama on a bus with her granddaughter and dog, and she needed money for a hotel because she was here for breast cancer treatment. I honestly told her I had no money on me, which I always make sure of because I don't like giving money to people who might use it for drugs. If someone wants food, I'd rather buy it for them. She then asked me if I knew the area well. Wanted to just get out of the situation. I lied and said I didn't, hoping she would leave me alone. Then she asked, "Okay, since the weather is so bad, could you drive me to my hotel to meet my granddaughter and dog who are waiting in the lobby? It's just up the road. I can show you." I'm a Christian, and I was always taught to help people out. So, even though everything about the situation was telling me to deny her again, I told her sure because I was raised with the rule, never judge a book by its cover. Plus, being 6 feet tall, I figured I could handle her if things got dicey. She jumped into my truck, and the next thing I knew, she was smoking a cigarette in my truck. I politely asked her to put it out. Nervous, I missed my first red flag when she asked me for a cigarette, since she obviously had them. She obliged and threw the cigarette out the window, to my dismay. We started driving up the road toward her hotel, and at that point, I was on high alert. As I was running through worst-case scenarios in my head, I noticed her fumbling through her purse, glancing at me from the corner of her eye. I told her, "Just so you know, I have a gun in my truck, so don't try anything crazy." I did have a gun, but it was a shotgun that I hadn't taken out of the back seat a few days earlier. So in that moment, it wouldn't have been helpful if she pulled a gun on me. She stopped messing around with her purse, pulled out her phone, and then looked at me and said, "Actually, do you mind taking a deeder? I need to pick up some money from some friends of mine." At this point, red flags were going off, but I kept thinking, never judge a book by its cover. So I said it was fine, but we had to make it quick because I really needed to get home. Right then, she dialed someone on the phone and said, "Yeah, this guy's coming over to bring me to get the stuff. You're ready, right?" I asked her if I could talk to the person. When I answered the phone, a man with a voice that sounded like he'd been smoking since birth answered. I started asking him questions like, "What's your name?" When I asked him if he knew of any hotels nearby, he seemed to stumble over his words and then said he had to go. At this point, I should have realized something was off and kicked her out of my truck. But for fear of her telling the truth and me feeling like a terrible person, I decided to keep going. We turned onto a street and saw a cop car parked to the side. I wanted to drop her off with the cop, but I'd feel awful if she was telling the truth. So I drove past the cop and she gave me this eerie smile, saying, "Glad he's here. Now I feel safe." As we entered the apartment complex, I saw how run down it was. It looked like a place with heavy drug traffic, just a very unsettling area, even with the snow. When I parked outside the place she said was her friend's, she said, "Okay, I'll go get the guy. I'll be right back." I was very unsettled, as everything about this situation felt wrong. She saw my face showing that I wanted to get out of there, and she sneered at me, saying something like, "You're a terrible person if you leave me here, especially in this weather and under these conditions." That's when I got angry. After all, I had already gone out of my way to help her. While waiting, I started thinking about what could happen. What if she came back with a gun or worse? At that moment, I saw 3 guys walking toward my truck, and I realized things weren't right. She had set me up to rob me or something because these guys were big and one of them had something hidden behind his back. I immediately put the vehicle in reverse and took off. Thank God for four-wheel drive. I looked back to see them chasing me, and the guy with the object behind his back had a crowbar. I don't know what would have happened to me, but looking back, I realized how dumb and blind I was. There was no hotel anywhere near where I was. The nearest one was 20 minutes away. If I had waited for them to get to my truck, they probably would have beaten and robbed me, or worse. I thank God every day that I escaped and was able to get married after this event. Since then, I've never been back to that Walmart or that area. A few months later, I told a coworker about this experience, and he said that the same woman had tried to do the same thing to him about a year ago, but he turned her down right away. Smart move on his part. Various tools and other small things like generators and low-level construction or farming equipment that someone from the area couldn't afford to buy, but needed to use occasionally. This was a small, family-run business where everyone knew each other. The office was only open on days when someone would drop by, and it was generally a mutually beneficial situation for the business owners and the locals. Since I was hired in a nearby business and my dad recommended me, they trusted me to come in for 15 to 20 hours a week to check and file rental forms, ensure no one missed a payment if there was a payment plan, and answer a couple of emails about prices and availability. A very simple job. The old building where I worked was about 90 years old and stood at the top of a small hill. The downstairs used to be a country bar until the 1970s when this family bought it cheaply, cleared out the bar, and fenced in the property to use its parking lot to store all the rental equipment and gear. I could generally come and go as I pleased, work any hours I wanted as long as the work got done. So when things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a couple of days, I usually came in after 7 p.m. and stayed until around midnight or 1 a.m., just to enjoy the music and take my time. The office where I worked was on the second floor of the building, above the old bar, and looked out onto the long driveway. I would often glance out the window, and once or twice I saw a family of deer or a raccoon running by, as any movement was very noticeable. It was an incredibly remote place, very quiet and still. So if something unusual happened or if something fell off, I definitely noticed it. One night during winter, a few inches of snow had fallen, and my dad told me to stay in because the roads were bad, but I had an old SUV, and more than that, I just really wanted to get out of the house. So I went into work around 8 p.m. and planned to stay until just after 1 a.m. I always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill because, believe me, no one ever showed up at night. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. The nearest house was about 2 miles away, and to even turn onto the road leading to our building, you had to know it was there. It really was a locals-only kind of place, and very small, as the family that owned it had inherited a lot of money and did the rental business more as a side thing. Basically, no one could just randomly get lost and end up in our building. So anyway, I was jamming to some Fall Out Boy, having some coffee, and kept glancing at the snow outside since our one orange streetlight reflected off the snow in a cool way. Around midnight, I went downstairs to the big bathroom, did my business, and then came back upstairs to settle into my work. I probably worked for about 5 minutes when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint in the fresh snow just below the light. It looked like it must have been a big dog or some large animal that had just rolled around on the ground on its back or something. Since I hadn't noticed it just 15 minutes before, it must have happened while I was in the bathroom or maybe when my back was turned. I shook it off and assumed it was a dog or perhaps even a farm animal that had gotten loose and was attracted to the light. That was common in the area. Around 2 a.m., I was leaving, and as always, I got out of my car to lock the gate. To be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow, but when I looked down, I was shocked to see that it wasn't just disturbed snow. It was undeniably the imprint of a human-made snow angel. If you don't know what a snow angel is, it's when kids lie on their backs in the snow and move their arms and legs back and forth. So when they get up, it looks like an angel's outline. I used to do this when I was a kid, so I knew for sure that's what it was, but it wasn't made by a child. It was made by a very large person, at least a normal-sized adult wearing heavy layers of winter clothing. I looked up and realized that whoever made the snow angel could easily have seen me through the window, so they must have waited for me to head downstairs to make it. I would have definitely heard or seen if someone had driven up to the building, So I knew that whoever made it had walked several miles in the freezing cold snow, stopped in front of the building, and made the snow angel while I was down the stairs. I looked around for tracks in the snow and saw only one set that led into the woods on the right side of the building. So it was clear that the person hadn't used the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which made me feel instantly uneasy since that side was just trees and darkness for miles. I was definitely freaked out now because I realized someone had been so close to me, secretly in the woods. I looked around but didn't see anything and just wanted to get out of there. When I got back in my car, I realized my boss would be there in a few hours and might see the same snow angel and assume I made it, since he probably thought I kept the gate locked when I was there. It wouldn't have been a huge deal, but I was young and didn't want him to make fun of me. So I quickly opened the gate again, ran over, kicked the snow to hide the angel, locked it up again, and got back in my car. I should also note that this really happened, but I almost lied here and said something else because it seems fake. I assumed most people wouldn't get out of their SUV, just because they were embarrassed about a snow angel, but at the time I was insecure and cared a lot about what others thought. Unfortunately, that's what I did. I wasn't exactly terrified at that point, although it was unsettling. I just thought it was weird and might have been some illegal hunter, even though hunting at night in the cold didn't make much sense. Anyway, the imprint had been made 2 hours earlier, so I assumed they were long gone, but that's when I heard it. As I was getting into my car, there was the loudest, highest-pitched laughing coming from the woods. The laugh I heard almost sounded fake, like something from The Wizard of Oz or a similar story. It felt like someone was pretending to laugh on purpose, to show that they weren't scared of me or to demonstrate how I reacted once I realized they were laughing at me on our property. It was loud enough that I knew they could probably see me, but I couldn't see them at all, as there was no illumination aside from the storyline I was caught in. After a few seconds, the laugh stopped, and then it was completely silent except for the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. Then the laugh started again, but louder this time, almost like a mix of screaming and laughing. I froze for a few seconds, listening with panic. I spent a lot of time in this area, and I knew what coyotes and foxes sounded like at night with their high-pitched cries during mating season, so I couldn't completely rule that out. But to me, it honestly felt like it was an adult man trying to imitate a woman's laugh, like someone deliberately trying to make a fake scary laugh to scare someone. And it worked. After those 5 seconds, I was immediately filled with adrenaline, jumped into my car, and drove away as fast as I could without losing control of the vehicle. When I got home, I stayed up trying to figure it out and even told my parents the story when they woke up. After talking it over, we all agreed on 2 possibilities. Either my brain somehow convinced itself that the snow formation looked like an angel, but it was just caused by some animal, and the tracks and the laugh were from a coyote or red fox. Although I don't think that's what happened. I truly believe the second possibility, which is that a local person was walking around for some reason and decided to mess with me. I didn't have any close friends in that area who would have done this. And if they had, they would have surely mentioned it to make fun of me for speeding away in terror. I found out later that the nearest house was owned by a very old couple, so I highly doubt it was them, which means whoever went out in the woods at night in the freezing cold did it just to mess with a stranger. I don't have any mental issues or a family history of them. I didn't do drugs, and I only drank socially at the time, but definitely not that night. I also don't believe in the paranormal, so that never crossed my mind. But I knew someone was out there. I worked there for another 6 weeks and never had another issue. Although I didn't know where my boss kept his gun, and I always made sure it was there when I started my shift. I definitely always locked the gate from that point on. Thinking back to that night, what freaked me out the most was that he must have waited for me to leave for about 2 hours just to make that laugh. He didn't know me. I could have been the type of person to get angry and try to find him and attack him. Yet he didn't seem scared or worried as he tried to mess with me. For some random guy, this is probably a story he tells to make his friends laugh hysterically. But for me, that guy, the one I call the angel in the snow guy with that laugh I'll never forget, well, I hope I never encounter him or anything like it again. This happened when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone and all their business. The town was historic and beautiful. Nothing bad ever seemed to happen, except for the rare death or murder. There were two that still stand out in my memory, but that's for another post. My family lived on a main road running through town, directly across from my local kindergarten through 8th grade school. We lived in a farmhouse with no farm, just 4 acres of land. I loved it. However, this day is one I've never been able to shake from my memory. The area I lived in is known for its very long, snowy winters. The forecast predicted a heavy snowstorm to roll through in the late afternoon and evening. Because of this forecast, most schools in the area decided to close for the day and the following day. My mom, who hated snow, insisted that my dad call out of work to help with me, my younger brother, and my older sister. Most of the help was needed to clear the snow, as we already had 1.5 feet on the ground from previous storms. Soon after, my mom and I went to a popular chain bookstore. I can't remember why or what she needed there, but I do remember leaving the store with a new stuffed llama to add to my growing collection of stuffed animals. I was thrilled. Anyway, we went home with her book and my new stuffed animal, and were ready to call it a day. Shortly after we returned, the first snowflakes began falling from the sky. My brother, who was only a year younger than me, began begging my parents to bundle him up so we could go out and play in the snow. They agreed, but I had to go out with him, and we had to stay in the driveway where they could see us. I got all dressed in my snow gear and even found a spare sweater to put on my new llama. My brother took an extra 20 minutes to get dressed because my mom had to help him. Picture the brother from A Christmas Story, and that was him. Once bundled up, we stomped outside in our boots and stiff jackets and started playing in the snow. Time flew by. We built a snowman, a fort, and even had a snowball fight. Before long, I was too cold and wanted to go back inside. But my brother didn't. While I was trying to convince him to come inside with a promise of hot cocoa and a movie, a small maroon sedan pulled into our driveway. It struck me as odd. Who would be out driving in this weather? Then I realized it looked just like my Aunt Penny's car. I quickly ran inside to tell my parents that she was here, leaving my brother outside all alone. "Aunt Penny's here," I shouted. My dad rushed past me to the window, and my mom followed. I wondered why they looked so concerned over a family visit. So, I ran back outside to greet her. But when I got outside, I saw that the car had pulled into our driveway, right next to where my mostly immobile brother was standing. I waved at him and smiled, ready to greet our aunt, who lived nearly an hour away. Instead, however, I was greeted by an older thin man with dark circles under his eyes and wispy gray hair. He kept his empty eyes focused on my brother. They looked hungry, as if he was feasting on the kid with his gaze. My stomach sank, and I immediately went into stranger danger mode, pulling my brother a foot back with me. "Hey kids, are your parents home? Are you alone?" he asked. I stepped back another foot and shyly replied that they were inside. My mom had always told me to say this, whether she was home or not, in hopes of scaring anyone away with bad intentions. The man's whole demeanor shifted. The hunger in his eyes disappeared. He looked panicked and frustrated. Then, he quickly tried to back out of our oddly shaped driveway, but his tires were sliding on the fresh snow. Before I knew it, my dad was there. "Hey, can I help you?" he asked. The man looked at him and started rummaging through his car. I moved closer and saw nothing but lumpy trash bags and filth in the back seat. "Yeah, I'm looking for Smith Road." The man answered that my dad pulled my brother and me close to him. "You know what town you're in, right?" According to him, there is no road with that name. The man fumbled a few more words, apologized, and quickly left our driveway. Then my dad wrote down his license plate number and called the local police to report what had happened. They advised us to just stay inside for the day and thanked him for the information, that I never played with that toy llama again, that IT went into my old toy bin and never came out. Until we moved years later, only to be sold at our yard sale, that I always had a bad feeling about that day, and what could have happened if my dad hadn't come outside. I wanted to get rid of anything that reminded me of it. The fact that it shook my parents made me uneasy, as they weren't easily scared. I don't know who the man was or why he wanted to know if our parents were home. But the gut feeling I had at the time, and still have over 10 years later, was that he was looking for something more than the non-existent Smith Road, that I'm a 21-year-old woman. And this story happened when I was about 11. That I remember that day clearly because it was the first time I was ever allowed to walk to and from school alone. Until I was 14, I lived in what we thought was a safe place in Chautauqua County, New York. Everyone knew everyone that if you thought you could get away with something, you better be prepared for everyone to know about it by the time you got home. But there was one day, it was a cold winter day, and unfortunately, school was still open. All the neighborhood kids had to walk through knee-high snow just to get to school. It took me a little longer to leave the house because I was used to walking to school with my older sister, as she knew the routes better than I did. I always used to make fun of her for being so paranoid, taking a different route every day to school. But after that day, I learned that was what actually saved my life. Yes, I was standing by the door, ready to leave. My mom came up to me and told me I should ride with her to drop me off because my sister was too sick to go today. Being a brat, I threw a fit about walking by myself. Because I was almost 12 and all my friends' parents let them walk alone. She stared at me for a long while, then said to make sure I paid attention to cars that I had once been hit by a car and almost died when I was 9. So her concern was well warranted. That I quickly nodded and headed out the door to go to school. My sister didn't like to waste time, so she always rushed to get to school early. But since it was just me now, I thought it would be a good idea to take my time. That I played in the brown slush left on the side of the road and even made funny-looking snowballs to see how far I could throw them. Anyway, halfway to school, I noticed the typical creepy white van following behind me. Being the playful child I was, if I had been bending down to make another snowball, I wouldn't have even noticed it. Creeping up the street, that I told myself I was just being stupid and paranoid, but kept walking more hurriedly to school. Once I got to school, I glanced over my shoulder and saw the same van just a few feet behind me. It wasn't until I was on school grounds that it drove away quickly right past me that I thought that would be the end of it. But throughout the day, when I stared out the window, the van was still there. That I assumed it never really left, just parked. Many adults later tried to convince me that it might not have been the same one, but I knew deep down that it was. The van in question had a bright yellow smiley emoji sticker on it. I couldn't see who was inside, but through the tinted glass, I knew they could see me. Well, it was now the end of the day, and I really wasn't ready to go home. It was too late to call my mom because she was at work and my sister was still sick at home. That I had to just suck it up and start walking home. That I tried to blend in with a group of kids, but most of them were car riders, and the others didn't even live near me. Remembering what my sister had told me, I took a different route home. That I didn't memorize this route clearly, but I decided anything was better than being spotted by that van. That I made it to my main street, but realized my mistake too late. The route I took led back to the main street where I walked to school. Behind a row of cars was the van with the smiley emoji sticker. That I tried to stay calm and walk past, but once I heard the van door silently click open, I ran. That I could hear the rush of 2 heavy pairs of footsteps behind me. They were getting closer, so I did what any normal kid would do. I cut corners. That I ran through someone's backyard until I was directly in front of my house and forced myself into thick snow to make it to the door. My heart was racing, not because of running, but because I could still hear them behind me. That I made it to the door and banged with all my might until someone came to the door. My sister was confused, but one look at my face, and she pulled me inside and locked the doors. The van was still outside. Truthfully, it stayed there until my brother got home. My sister and I don't talk about it, but we both knew how close I was to going missing. That I hadn't thought about this incident in years, but one of my hometown friends showed me an article from 2013 that apparently some men had kidnapped and assaulted a girl my own age. But it wouldn't have scared me if it hadn't mentioned the white van. However, you, the one who tried to kidnap me, and who knows what else. I'm just so very glad you didn't succeed. That I quickened my pace, and he ended up just circling around me. Soon, he blocked my path again, pulled out a cigarette, and got right up in my face, trying to light it, but the wind and snow made it difficult. I took that moment to slip away from him, but he kept getting in front of me while trying to light the cigarette. I reached the CTA stop to go downstairs, but because he was so tall, he used his massive body to block the stairs in front of me. He was staring me down, and I wasn't sure what to do at that point. However, just then, an older woman came by, and he let her pass. I quickly darted through the small opening he made for her and asked if I could stick with her because of my situation. She was very understanding. I wanted to tell the CTA staff, but, of course, There was no one in the booth. We pulled out our cards at the same time and went through the turnstiles together. He noticed that I was with her and tried to dash toward us, but it seemed he ran out of money or something because he didn't get through until a few minutes later. My new friend and I started making small talk to help me calm down, and she asked what train I was taking and what my stop was. To our surprise, we were headed in the same direction and had the exact same stop. He followed us down and was still smoking a cigarette, but that's when the sea noticed him and began walking toward him. He turned around to quickly finish his cigarette, which meant he looked away from us. At that moment, my train arrived, and we both got on. He saw us and tried to get on, but he missed it by just a few seconds. We both thought that was a close call. We kept talking even after we got off at our stop, and to my surprise, she ended up dropping me off at my house since she lived just a block ahead of me. Small world. This encounter happened to me 6 years ago when I was 16. For context, I'm female. I live in New England, a northeastern region of the United States where winters are very snowy, with long, cold, dark nights and short days. One such night in February, I was alone in my parents' house, which is in a safe, quiet suburban neighborhood where the houses are about 100 feet apart. My parents had divorced years ago, but were still on good terms. So, when my mom decided to sell our childhood home, my dad bought it so I could continue living there. During the move, neither of my parents stayed in the house for a couple of nights, and only my room upstairs had furniture. The rest of the house was mostly empty with boxes scattered around, and the internet hadn't been switched over yet, so I often sat at the far end of the living room, using our neighbor's Wi-Fi. It was fun not having my parents around for a couple of nights, so I stayed up late with my new laptop and surfed the web until the early hours of the morning. On my second night alone, it snowed late into the evening, and I sat in the dark living room on a folding chair, with only my laptop screen providing light, while the snow quietly fell outside. The neighborhood was silent, as cars don't usually drive by after 10 p.m., and neighbors stay inside to keep warm. At 2:30 a.m., I decided to head to bed and was wrapping up my internet activities for the night when I heard 3 very slow, quiet knocks on the front door just a few feet away. I immediately closed my laptop, knowing that the bright screen made me visible to anyone outside since the windows weren't covered. I got off my chair and walked very quietly over to the door, kneeling down below a window to listen outside. Frozen with fear, I waited for about 2 full minutes when I heard 3 more identical knocks. They were very slow and would have been too quiet to wake anyone who had been sleeping. I gathered the courage to look outside the window and saw a dark figure standing very close to the front door, dressed in a black winter coat and black pants. A hood pulled over his head obscured his face and hair, and he stood still with his arms at his sides. I considered calling the police, but ultimately decided to continue waiting. I moved back behind the door, away from the window, and after about 2 more minutes passed, I saw the man walking down the walkway past the front of the house, leaving. Suddenly, he stopped, turned around, and looked directly at the window through which I was watching him. About 15 seconds passed as we stared at each other, but I couldn't see his face due to the darkness of his hood. Finally, he turned around and walked down the driveway and down the street. He didn't stop at any other houses, just continuing down the street in the falling snow, and I watched him for about 10 minutes until he completely faded into the darkness. As far as I know, this hasn't happened since. I still live in that house and occasionally have nightmares in which the scene replays itself. But in the dreams, I open the door for him.